So hello everyone, welcome to Chosŏn History Society Zoom event. My name is Sean Han, and I will be hosting Dr. Sujung Kim's Zoom talk today. As an associate director of the Chosŏn History Society, we've been hosting Zoom events with participation from scholars in Korea, United States, and Europe. And we are very delighted to have both familiar faces and new faces here today. And we are really thrilled to have Dr. Sujung Kim as our today's speaker. Before we start, I'd like to first briefly introduce about our organization, the Chosŏn History Society. So Chosŏn History Society, or CHS, is a public learned society fostering an active community of researchers and learners of Korea's past by connecting scholars working both inside and outside of professional academia. The CHS is a community based on sharing rather than competition or exclusivity. It provides opportunity not only for junior and senior scholars in the field of Korean studies, but also for those who are operating independently or otherwise under resources to share research and generate their network. The CHS will also connect the scholars with one another, fostering a network for shared interests. In our most recent event, we hosted a roundtable on the academic journal publishing in the field of Korean studies in English language academic journals. If you missed those previous events, please check our Chosŏn History Society YouTube channel to view those recorded events. Overall, our Chosŏn History Society hosts talks, workshops, and public lectures and other events to develop and host public resources for the study, research, and teaching of Korea's past. Now we are moving on to the creation of a new platform of scholar exchange and publication. So please sign up for our latest events and stay tuned. So in our today's Zoom meeting, we have other CHS team members, including Luis Botella. So Luis Botella is the Europe-based scholar event coordinator, and he is a professor at University of Malaga, Spain, for Europe-based scholars. And now before we actually get started for today's talk, please let me introduce Dr. Sujung Kim. Sujung Kim is an associate professor at DePauw University. She received her PhD in East Asian languages and culture from Columbia University in 2014, and her master's degree in Buddhist philosophy from Korea University in 2007. Sujung Kim joined the DePauw University in 2014, and since then, she has taught a wide range of courses on Buddhism and East Asian religions. While her research primarily centers on pre-modern transcultural interaction between Japanese and Korean religions, her interdisciplinary research interest also includes modern and contemporary Korean Buddhism. Her first book, Shinra Myojin and Buddhist Networks of the East Asian Mediterranean, which is published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2019, focused on a deity called Shinra Myojin. The book explains that Shinra Myojin is not only a god, influential protector god of the Onjoji temple in Japan, but also part of the transnational network of people, ideas, and gods spanning China, Korea, and Japan. Currently, Dr. Kim is working on her second book project, which is titled Korean Magical Medicine, Buddhist Healing Talisman in Chosŏn Korea, which she investigates the religious, historical, and iconographic dimensions of healing talismans produced in Buddhist settings during the Chosŏn period. Although its primary focus is Buddhist healing talisman in Chosŏn Korea, the book also locates itself in the broader East Asian context, aiming at showing the complex web of talismanic culture in East Asia. And this book project is also supported by ACLS Robert H. and Ho Family Foundation. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Sujung Kim, and let's hear from her today. Please, Dr. Kim, please unmute yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you so much for your invitation to the History Society. And everyone, thank you for coming here. And I'm very excited to see you all here. So today I'm going to talk about my part of my book project, and this is still a work in progress. So I would very appreciative if you can have any other suggestions and corrections and the directions after this talk. So let me dive in. Okay. So this is outline. I like to start with some broader questions, why I'm studying this, and then give you some more historical background, and then give you more specific example. And then I will also talk about some other interesting aspects about this talismanic culture, and then I will conclude. So the overarching questions for this particular safe childbirth talisman is this: how did Chosŏn Buddhist beliefs and practices inform and influence their perspectives and prescriptions on women's reproductive health? More specifically, what roles did the Buddhist talismans play in the art of healing, and how Chosŏn women's childbirth experiences can effectively be detected from the existing textual and material evidence? So I like to sort of introduce the overall sort of significance of this particular talisman. So in my forthcoming book I'm writing at the moment, so it's tentatively titled Korean Magical Medicine, Buddhist Healing Talismans in Chosŏn Korea. The reason I got interested in talisman is it's so understudied, and of course there are some good studies on some art historical aspects of talismans in Korea. Also, there are many interesting Chinese talismanic studies, including Chinese medical medicine, which you know that where this title comes from. So Michel Strickman is one of the pioneering scholarship who studied on early Buddhist or Taoist talismans, mostly from Dunhuang. So there are like James Robson, and there are other people, Paul Kopp, who studied seal, but also has greatly related to the study of talismans. There are a lot of interest in recent scholarship on talismans. Also, I think recently there was also one Princeton PhD dissertation came out just 2 months ago. So there is huge interest, I think, but no one really has written on Joseon period talismans. And the thing is, Joseon has a lot of, if you go to museums and some private collections, there are tons of talismanic evidence, talismans or wood blocks that has been used during the Joseon period. So that's kind of how I got interested in this, and also why I chose Joseon, because of its abundance of materials. So there are a lot of talismans. So that the typology is also a very big problem, how to categorize in a more meaningful and analytical way. But I chose specifically to focus on healing talismans, because we live in pandemic period, right? And everyone's mind is thinking about healing and therapy. And so I thought deliberately, maybe I'd focus on healing talismans, but also historically, among all these talismans that are in Sinic world, healing seems to be the very first use of talismans, as coming from the evidence from Wangdui tomb in China. So among all these healing talismans, I particularly chose a couple of talismans to focus on as a case study in my book. And one of them is the safe childbirth talisman. It particularly is interesting to me because it really captures, or I try to allows us to capture women's experience, women's reproductive health, which is also another very understudied topic. So there is a very important text that almost always contains this talisman, safe childbirth talisman. And that text is called, a little bit long, so the Great Dharani of the Buddha's Uṣṇīṣa, Heart of Avalokiteśvara Bodhisattva. It's too long, so I'm going to abbreviate. So from this talk, I'm going to refer this text to the Crown Dharani. It's roughly mid-9th century. It's indigenous Chinese text. It's not translation from Indian Sanskrit to Chinese, but this is a Chinese invention, which is very important to keep in mind. And in the text, the text, almost like a QR code, you know, if you see some poster at the end, there's QR code, right? QR code meaning quick response code. The talisman appears at the end of this text. And also the text actually mentions the name of this talisman, and it says in Korean, 비자인. And I am translating as the more direct translation should be secret letter seal, but I'm going to talk about more later, but throughout this talk, I'm going to say safe childbirth talisman. I already mentioned this is Chinese origin, and it has hugely popular. There's Tangut, Uyghur, so many translations are found, and they have multicultural impacts. Of course, in China, Korea, it was composed in China, but of course the rest of China, and also in Korea as well as Japan. So the oldest edition, it's scholars believe that it's from Dunhuang, Paleo, 3916, and that example seems to be very interesting. Doesn't have this talisman. So there's a text, the Crown Dharani text, but there's no talisman. But the earliest extant visual example comes from 1143 from the Fangshan stone Tripitaka. Some of you are interested in Chinese religions. You probably know this Fangshan stones Tripitaka, which was started around 7th century in Sui dynasty in China. And that time Buddhism was suffering from the anti-Buddhism campaign. So there's one monk decided to carve every Buddhist sutra available to that time, carve on stones, tablets. So that became over 1,000 years project. And actually there are two Crown Dharani sutras included in the Fangshan Tripitaka, but one of them has a clear date, which is 1143. So now in this screen, you see on the left-hand side, the Dunhuang, the oldest one, mid-9th century. And scholars know that because thankfully, if you pay attention to the middle of this, here. So this little hole tells us actually more than you think. So it's a Poti style. Manuscriptologists already had abundance study on this, but basically with this, scholars know that this can be datable around 9th century, mid-9th century. But as I said, so if you look at it, here is where the sutra ends. This is volume 3. The Crown Dharani has 3 fascicles, and it says this is the end of it. But then we see two lines saying the Dharani, and there is how to recite the Dharani. Instruction is included. On the right-hand side, this is the Fangshan stone Tripitaka. And the same thing, the sutra ends here, and then we have same 2 incantations or Dharani. And then we have this. This is first visual example of bizain or safe childbirth talisman that I'm going to talk about throughout this talk. Now, before I go to the Korean side, I'd like to give you some more interesting investigations that I found throughout my research. So here again, this is the safe childbirth talisman that I just introduced to you. To my best knowledge, when you start this talisman, you as a historian, the most daunting question is where this come from, right? And I still have not found the exact origin, or maybe there are multiple origins. But what I can tell you now is you can see the broader network between this talisman and also medical tradition. So the bottom here, this is a part of the screenshot of the text called Wai Tai Mi Ya Fang. This is in English, secret and essential formula form of on outer sensor. So I say secret and essential because it's kind of also long too. But so this text, secret and essential, written by very famous Tang period physician Wang Tao, is very important medical text, has hugely important in the later East Asian medical tradition. And that text has one section on gynecology, and it has 6 talismans, and 2 of them, so all of the 6 talismans are something to do with healing, to treat sort of birth-related problems. And one of them seems to be very, very visually clearly linked to this, the last one in the Bisain, or safe childbirth talisman. And interestingly, the next one that you see, I know that the visual is not clear to you probably, but this one is also leads me to think about another important safe childbirth talisman that has been very popular throughout Joseon period, which is this one on the right-hand side. So this one is called Chosŏn. We know the name because, do you know, everyone probably know who are interested in Korean studies, Sujung, the 16th century, 17th century or 17th century court physician, the most highly praised book that he edited is the Treasured Mirror of Eastern Medicine, 동의보감 in Korean. So 동의보감 has one talisman, just one. And that one is this one that you are seeing here. So this talisman, as you see, it's also kind of similar to this one. It's stacking different talismans and making one big giant talisman. And so if you are interested in more about this talisman, like 산실청 총교 or 호산청 일기, this is Korean titles, but throughout the Joseon period, when queens or royal consorts giving a birth, they actually temporarily installed a particular institution where a lot of people, group of people kind of also kept a record of what's going on in that particular moment of delivery and preparation and all the entire procedure. And they actually can tell us this talisman was actively used. So what I like to argue, I will actually argue later in my the paper, is this is very likely this talisman on the left-hand side is Buddhist talisman, which I mean by talisman used in the Buddhist setting, or just like this one, kept in Buddhist sutra, so that it was circulated within that Buddhist network, whereas this one seems to be more favored ever since Sujung's effort, more popularly used within more, I don't want to necessarily say Confucian circle, but non-Buddhist audience, or mostly elite people who were able to access to Sujung's texts, thought this talisman is the good one to go with when you have some difficulties in labor. Now, I'd like to also give you some little more ideas about how talisman works. Talisman is not just one-dimensional paper, sheet of paper that you just look at. It actually allows you to engage in a more somatic, more performative level. So Dharani is always accompanied with talismans. So for this particular safe childbirth talismans, we have 2 incantations I already have introduced to you, but one is Om Chum. I don't know whether I pronounced it correctly, but this is how, to my best knowledge, this is how you Romanize. The next one is Om Brum. And each talisman has also embedded in another textual tradition. And what is interesting about the first Dharani, the single letter golden wheel turning ruler Dharani, it's kind of also a long name, is actually coming from, it seems from my study, proto-esoteric, proto-tantric Indian practice, somehow related to Ayurvedic tradition. And often this particular Dharani comes from Manjushri related texts like Manjushri Mulakarpa, which also became very, very important text in the esoteric Buddhist circle in China. But somehow that Dharani made its way to the Crown Dharani Sutra, so we have that one. And the second one is also coming from different textual tradition. By Shajaguru, this is medicine Buddha, the Buddha who is in charge of healing. By Shajaguru's healing worm toxin Dharani. This particular Dharani is addressing or addressing the power of particular Buddha. And this also has to do with a lot of long history. But what is also interesting for those of you who are interested in Chön Buddhism, in Korean Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism, of course, especially Chön circle, they use this Dharani a lot for different purpose. But anyway, my whole point of showing this two Dharanis is that the crown Dharani specifically instructs you, make you to do things. So basically, you should recite these Dharanis 21 times, and you actually hold that talisman, crown talisman, in front of a Buddha image, and then you incinerate. You basically burn the talisman, and then you probably find that. So I'm going to tell you more about it, but fragrant water, and then you put that ashes in the water, and then you mix it and drink it, and that hopefully give you some treatment if you're having some trouble in childbirth. So now I know it's been a little bit late, but I'd like to introduce talisman in a more proper way, though broader definition that I have. What I mean by talisman is any tangible object believed to hold magical properties and powers. It's a very broadest term that I could think about. But in my project, I'm more interested in one type, as I mentioned, often paper talisman. So what you see on the left and right, this is one example of Buddhist talismans. And as I said, there are a plethora of examples in Buddhist circle. And a lot of people in Korea, when I say I'm studying talismans, and they say, oh, bujok, right? So bujok is a very commonly used term in Korean, but a lot of people do not know this is actually a coined term. Doesn't come up in pre-modern sources. In my knowledge, this term, although this is kind of interesting, it has paper character here, so it kind of serves my point too. But bujok is 70s, around the 1970s. It was coined by some scholars or some person. I say a person because bujok or talismans in Korea has also very little studied. There's one good book on by Kim Young-ja, I think. Anyway, so in pre-modern sources, we have this character. In Korean, we say bu, or sometimes buin. In Korea period, we see a lot of this character, buin, or sometimes in, as we already see, pizza in, right? So a lot of my sources basically interchangeably use fu or pu in Korean, or in, same in Chinese, in. They use interchangeably. What is interesting about Buddhist talismans is that we have this kind of, I kind of gave you two representative examples. On the left-hand side, this is actually a stacking of different talismans, but this kind of talisman, especially this or this, it's kind of, if you have trained eyes, oh, this is sort of the, the shape and the characters, some elements looks like some Chinese character based, right? So we have this food talismans, but also we have something like on the right-hand side, Dharani talismans. So the Dharani is sacred sound, right? It's capturing the sacred power of particular divinities. But once you make a correct pronunciation of that incantation, that kind of gives you some power to do whatever you want. So Dharani has been incredibly powerful tool for Buddhism to spread all levels of society. And Dharani talisman, a lot of people also mistakenly think that talisman that I'm talking about is started from China, but it's not. It actually starts from Indian Buddhism, and we have long span of sort of evolvement. And what we see in our Joseon period is a lot of this scenic, but both, but mostly a lot of these Chinese letters, but also Lancha letters that we see both. So as I said, my talismanic framework is coming from India to China, China to Korea. And what is interesting, one aspect that I like to focus on here is when talisman came into being, actually there were some obvious tensions between two groups. So more conservative groups within Buddhism. So we have two different voices, two parallel voices. One saying, as I quoted in this very important text called Long Discourses or Digha Nikaya. This is one of the oldest Indian texts translated into Chinese. And it says that do not do this, do not use, talismans and spells. Those are very wicked. They are not really, it goes against the Dharma. I'm sorry. I need to turn the light on. Okay, sorry for that. So it goes against the Dharma. Dharma means the Buddha's teaching. So Buddha, according to this group, Buddha didn't like that idea. What is interesting is actually in the later periods, these are two Dunhuang examples, and they actually, the other group says, actually, no, Buddha said that. So I know this is a little bit small, but this is in Korean Sejong, or we can see also Sejong. So what is interesting about this example, Dunhuang example, is that all the talisman is here, and then there it has, the background story of each talisman, how it came into being. And it all says Buddha actually, Buddha said, or according to the Buddha, right? So there is another group that justifying themselves, right? You do not use talismans, but you can use Buddhist talismans. What Buddha endorsed, you can use them. So we have a lot of like this character, like bull, right? So this kind of examples also allow us to think that there are two different voices or different groups who first was hesitant, but then later you see some embracing of this talismanic culture within Buddhism. Now I'd like to turn to historical development in Chosŏn Korea. So I give you some ideas and then I will give you some visual examples. So the Crown Dharani introduced to Korean Peninsula around 11th or 12th century. The oldest extant one is 1058, I believe. And this particular period is important because this was really the fete, Avalokiteśvara or Gwanum or Guanyin in Chinese, was big fete throughout East Asia. So this is also time when Goryeo has the earliest example of this Crown Dharani, therefore the safe childbirth talisman, but we also see similar patterns in Japan too. So for instance, there in Japan, my colleagues, Lomi Benedetta, and wrote an interesting article about Rokuji Kyo, which is 6 syllables of Kwanum or Avalokiteśvara Om Mani Padme Hum, became very, very influential to support Heian court ladies' childbirth from 11th century to 15th century. In Korean Buddhism, back to Korean Buddhism, as you know, those of you who study Korean Buddhism, we have very thin primary sources, but thankfully, Chosŏn Buddhists were very busy with stuffing Buddhist icons, right? Like mostly like sculptures, and to animate or to make alive, they did a lot of rituals known as Pulchångsim or ancient relics. So in it, we find a lot of talismans and Dharani talismans there, and also mortuary practices, another important aspects. When people died, they wanted to reborn in the Pure Land, or they wanted to purge their sins. So talismans were also found. I'm going to show you later, and that is dedicated to women devotees. So if you're interested in broader historical rhythm, I'd like to tell you that probably from the known examples, what I can tell you is in the earlier moment, 11th, 12th century examples, it was mostly used for personal use or royal elite families. Not necessarily safe birth talisman, but for the occasion of safe birth. But in the later mid-Joseon or later Joseon period, we see a lot of local literatis or more learned but scholarly groups also did not hesitate to use Buddhist talismans whenever they need it. And later, 19th century or even early 20th centuries, we see a lot of very not skillfully carved, but safe childbirth talismans are also individually used in the among the commoners. So the bigger picture behind is the fame or the popularity of safe childbirth talisman is the Avalokiteśvara was hugely important. It has very strong and steady worship in Chosŏn. And we have some scholars estimates in Korea, this Great Dharani was probably number 3 in terms of the sheer number of what is left here. So there are a lot of examples from Korea, but also in Joseon too. This was one of the best sellers basically in Korean Buddhism. So I'm going to show you some couple of images from now on. So this is the one that I mentioned, the early Guru examples, personal pendant. And we have this golden sutra box, and in it we find this folded accordion type folded crown dharani. And in it, of course, we have the talisman. This is another example of a gilt bronze sutra box. We actually know that this was won by Lady O, and early 14th century example. And we have this dharani, and dharani, it's actually siddham letters, and then also this, the dharani of the crown sutra. And then we have different talismans, but at the end, what you see is the bijain or the safe childbirth talisman. And also we have this, the Om Trim Om Broom, right? And then we have this Sanskrit character as well. This is a really interesting Korea period. I don't think we don't have Korea period example extent, but we have recarvings of this particular wood blocks. Probably started it at Hain Temple, where the Korean Tripitaka Koreana is stored. What we see here, right? The red part is our safe childbirth talisman. Actually, I'm writing another chapter for my book on this particular 24 Buddhist talismans, what those are, and all these things. So I can save this, spare you for the details later. But these wood blocks were actually very useful when you make sort of printings like this, right? So we have this another example. This is mortuary practice example. This is coming from tomb of Jeongwon. Jeongwon is a 15th century Confucian official. And when his wife died, we also see that she was kind of covered with this cloth, and we see these Buddhist talismans there. This is another mortuary example, and from the tomb of Lady E, who lived around 17th centuries. So we see later Joseon people, very likely people who believed in the faith of Amitabha or Pure Land or the Buddha in general. They kind of were not hesitant to use this Buddhist talismans to reborn or to cleanse their karma and this. So 1 to 3 is found in the inner garment called hansam, and the number for which is kind of fragmented because it was covered upper level, so it's more damaged. But actually this is the same, coming from the same wood blocks. So I mentioned Pulchång or enshrined relics, and this is another interesting example from the Hainsa Temple, Wondangam. And we have this wooden Amitabha Buddha, and inside, among many other things, we see the safe childbirth talisman. And this is the late Joseon, actually, probably very likely early 20th century, but very crude, unskilled, but here. So you see this one is the safe childbirth talisman, and this is wooden block. But once you print it, here we have this wood block talisman printed here. This is the last among this group that I'm introducing now. This is one is from Myeodoksa Temple, and this on the right hand side you see Gyujangak example. Gyujangak, one reason I juxtapose these two images is you have these three characters similar to the Fangshan stone Tripitaka, right? But also we have closely stacked. So these two, whether it's three different characters or one closely stacked together, these two examples coexisted throughout Joseon period. Although seems to be coming a little bit earlier. And what is interesting about this Gyujangak example is if you look at it very carefully, these are printed, but this character that I made red, right, this one, square inside, it actually somebody scribed it, then somebody wrote it, right? So what is written here is the six letters of Avalokiteśvara, Om Mani Padme Hum, in Chinese and also in Sanskrit. So maybe, I don't know, I cannot fully understand, but the bigger picture that we can getting from this is the people were clearly made a link to this is Avalokiteshvara's worship and the deity being the main deity who ensures safe childbirth talisman. And on top of this Dharani, maybe some people thought this needs to be also recited too. So now I'd like to move on to the more specific, dive into more specific case of Queen Insu. So now you see where this comes from. I'm going to tell you where this comes from, why it's important. So this is the end of this Crown Dharani. So Crown Dharani kept carved and printed throughout Joseon period, and one of the most important additions coming from 1485. So Queen Insu, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, she was really the important vector to facilitate further dissemination of this Dharani and this Crown Dharani and also the talisman, I think. So who is Queen Insu? Before I talk about it, Queen Insu actually, we know that this is sponsored by Queen Insu because at the end of this 1485 edition, we have postscript written by Buddhist monk named Hakjo. Hakjo, I don't know whether you have seen the recent movie 2019 Naramasami. He appears as he's not in the movie. He recites Sanskrit Dharani fluently. He's the one that Hakjo, very important Buddhist monk of his time. So, and he did a lot of Buddhist projects with from the order of Queen Insu. So what is interesting about this particular postscript is that it gives you the reason why Queen Insu was interested in sponsoring this particular Crown Dharani, because she says basically, well, Hakjo wrote it, but in order to ensure his long life and eliminate the evil spirits for the king. King here is King Seong. Queen Insu is the mother of King Seong or Seongjong. So I focus on this, eliminate evil spirits for the king. And so our Grand Queen Dowager Insu ordered artisans to study Tang edition very closely. And basically this is recarving of Tang edition. And we have the same equivalent of Tang edition. It has same format, same almost identical drawings. So it has two panels. Upper has the drawing, the paintings, then lower the Crown Dharani. But it also clearly mentions that this Dharani can be used for those people who are experiencing difficulty in childbirth. So this is how we know about. So what I'm interested in to tell you more about the story is what this possibly means. So I'm going to tell you. So Queen Insu, now you see the family genealogy, she became the dowager after King Song's father died. So King Song became the king at the age of 13. So he was too young. So his grandmother was sort of doing the politics on behalf of him. And King Song, when he was, he reached the age of marriageable age, he married one woman, and first wife died very young. Like when she died, she was 18 or something. And between the two, King Song and the first wife, they didn't have any child. So that's one thing. So King Song married another second one. So that is Queen Yun. And Queen Yun became Yunsi in Korean. Yunsi became the second wife, or now the official wife, right? So they were in love. They had two male children, and everything seemed to be fine. But I don't know whether I can make this joke, but basically this is Queen Elizabeth, and this is Charles, and this is Diana. So between the two didn't get along. So the Chosŏn Shillok, the veritable records of Chosŏn, details all these events very carefully. So after this talk, if you're interested, go there and then look at it. But basically, Queen Insu did not like her for various reasons, and basically, the king ends up inviting her to die. So he sends poison, and she had to drink it and then die. So if you look at the year, she died at the age of 27. Between the two, I said there are two princes, and one of them is the famous Yeonsan, Prince Yeonsan. Yeonsan was kept from all this family drama, but when he got to the throne, basically he learned that something Queen Insu did, or Shillok says that one night Prince Yeonsan goes to his grandma saying, "Why did you kill my mother?" So this became political turmoil, and eventually what happens is that she was very threatened by the Prince Yeonsan. And what is interesting about the year, remember the 1485 is the year that this particular edition that Queen Insu sponsored, the Great Dharani, right? And she also writes down the evil spirits to get rid of all these evil spirits. Is very interesting because when Queen Yun died, she died 1482, 3 years after, which is 1485, is the time that this particular Great Dharani was carved. So my smaller argument here is that it has to do with Queen Yun. When Queen Insu sponsors and particularly chose this text, it was very intentional, very particular moment, political moment, to ensure the secure lineage of the court, but also to get rid of evil, which is evil spirit, which is this, and also misfortunes that King Song had. He had some problem from first wife, he didn't get any heir, and second, he had, but this, according to Queen Insu's eye, this was sort of evil. And then now he have this problem. So this was, all of this kind of makes me think, allows us to think that Queen deliberately chose this text. Queen Insu, and this whole story was heavily dramatized. There are so many movies and Korean soap dramas, so you can learn more about those if you're interested in. So Queen Insu, sometimes in those popular depictions, she is described as sort of evil, court lady. But in Buddhism, she was great patron. She actually was so immersed in Buddhism, Buddhist. She did a lot of Buddhist projects. And in one instant in Shillok, we also see that she was very upset when all the Chosŏn officials were against what she's doing, the promoting Buddhism. And she said, "Why do you do that? Because why do you complain so much? Because all of this I do with my own money. What's wrong with you guys?" So apparently Queen Insu had big wealth to sponsor a lot of those Buddhist activities. So in Buddhism, she's like great patron. One thing that she did is also to translate the Great Dharani into vernacular Korean. So the same year, she not only produced the Chinese version, but also Korean translation as well. This became much bigger than she imagined. In the later Joseon period, we see the Crown Dharani itself is still a little bit longer to reprint and carve and all this. So now we see the emergence of more convenient method. So one page, one sheet of paper so in the Crown Dharani, there is one in volume 1, the fascicle 1 there, it has Dharani called Mo Dharani in it. And this Dharani becomes celebrated as the essence of the Crown Dharani. So you don't have to go through all entire Dharani, but you just print or carry it. That is sufficient enough. That idea became prevalent in the later period, and now you see also the safe childbirth talisman here. Now I'd like to move on to everyday use of the talisman. The reason I'm interested in these talismans are also, it was used by the elite people, as you know now, but also it was heavily used by the different social groups, especially the females and non-elites. That's what really draws me to this project more. So think about how talismans were used in the everyday setting. So it's not me, some other social historians, thanks to some records or still lists of the tombs of the females who lived in Joseon period, we know that a few statistics about those women's daily experience. They had to deliver a lot of babies, so many births, but a lot of those babies also died. So 60% of female members of aristocratic elites died before reaching their menopause in the 17th and 18th centuries. And on average, they produce close to 6 children in their life, because they marry young and then die a little bit young, but still throughout their that time period, they reproduce a lot, but only 50% of the children reached adulthood. We do not know how many women actually lost their lives through the birth or during the birth. But knowing this particular data, we can also guess it wasn't easy. They have to constantly experience or expose the fear, psychological, but also mental and physical pain they had to go through with this culture, right? And in my paper that I am about to finish, I didn't spend much time in this, but basically I also show a lot about, this is both magical and medical. What I mean by medical is the Crown Dharani doesn't seem to be just wishing for the best. It's not just, incantation and this mysterious characters will heal you. It's not just that, but actually they also use, but with faith. That's important part of this whole, talismanic culture. But also the Crown Dharani actually recounts several herbal recommendations when it says 3 different places. Drink this particular water made of this particular plants, and one of them is lemongrass. It's a Latin name. Lemongrass concoction was recommended to drink with the safe birth talisman. And from my research, lemongrass is known the Oriental medicine ingredients and often used for female reproductive health. So another question you may have is, were there people really using this talisman on their birthing bed? I do not have concrete answer to that. I hope so. From the Chosŏn, the 동의보감 허준's treasured mirror, it actually gives you some clear ideas about how Chosŏn was used. The mom who is delivering a baby actually can see that, and you actually burn it in front of that woman who is in active labor. So it's not far off, I think, to think this Buddhist talisman may have used in that period of particular juncture, the moment. But also probably when Buddhism was seen as heterodox ideology, except a few cases, probably it's also very plausible that it was used after when safely women delivered baby or babies, they kind of come to the Buddhist temple or for the monastics, and basically to commemorate, to appreciate the safe delivery, and then you kind of sponsor the Crown Dharani. And there are actually those examples we can see from the 19th century, 18th centuries. So overall, what I found from throughout my research is that in the beginning, remember the overarching questions, I wanted to know or rescue or see whether is there any evidence that we can capture women's experience. And it turned out it's not always, delivery is the most female experience, but it's not always entirely women's business. So Monica Green, she's a historian of medieval European history. She has written several books on this topic in the European context, and she made interesting points about male authority, and both medical and religious combined carried significant power even in this women's affair. Similarly, in East Asia too, we have constant men's intervention, both in description and prescription. So I don't give you, I can give you more examples later if you are interested in, but basically still men were a big part of this delivery scene. And even written records, little written records to really reveal the agency or active voice of women. We can assume that there are midwives or some female presence, experienced female existence may have helped all this facilitating this knowledge or the application of this talisman. But with current existing documents, I cannot really say much about it. But still, I think, as you have learned so far, the case of safe childbirth talismans illustrates lesser known aspects of Chosŏn Buddhists, women's dealing with childbirth, and how popular the Guanyin or Kwanseŭm worship made them to sort of engage with this particular talisman. So conclusion. So I like to highlight that this particular talisman helps us to think about this healing and ritualized healing. So safe childbirth talisman was actually what I argue is it's an outlet to express individual anxieties and social concerns around safe childbirth. So it was not just individual problem, but also socially and religiously dealt issue. And we see that it's large corpus extent examples of the Crown Dharani texts and also the talismans. And as I mentioned, its talisman is very interesting because it's not just viewing, but it's also actively do things with it. It has performative nature to it, right? You have to chant, vocal, you have to see, visual, and often you also use incense and also kind of olfactory, right? And also you touch. All this sense-related engagement also allows maybe affective effects, right? So self-childbirth talisman's connection also at the same time, it also has unexpectedly connected to the longer and broader Chinese medical tradition and also pharmacological practice. So that's another findings that I wanted to highlight. And also talismans as a more carefully curated strategy and technology available to around that time. And also when it comes to Buddhism in Korea, there are scholars who have worked on different periods, but Joseon period has been really big lacuna, right? To my knowledge, there is no even a book on one monograph on Joseon period Buddhism yet. So this talisman project, I think, can also illuminate more vibrant aspects of Joseon Buddhism, how much people were relying on available technology or methods and talismans were very, very big part of this Asian, but also widespread devotionalism in Chosŏn period. Murayama Jijun, colonial period Japanese ethnographer, wrote a text called a book called Chosŏn no Kizin, or Chosŏn no Kushin in Korean. And in it, we have examples of, he basically sent his people all over, or he himself also went all over the, Chosŏn Peninsula, and witnessed that people use talismans for healing all the time, for whatever skin problem, all the internal problems. So that is also one example why talisman has less studied as superstition and all this, but why it's so important, vibrant aspects of Chosŏn Buddhism. Lastly, my book overall, I'd like to engage with this bigger, bigger ideas such as material turn. What I mean by that is earlier scholarship tends to look at, especially those people interested in visuals, right, arts, often disregard or didn't even think talisman as worthy of scholarship. And similarly, a lot of religious studies people think talisman is always too superstitious. It's maybe the domain of art historians or maybe some other folk studies, right? But I think ontological turn, another sort of theoretical framework that I'm working with is talismans. As I said, it's not just passive items sitting there. It actually asks you to do things, instruct you to do things. And also the materiality and its sort of borrowed agency allows you to see more unexpected practices in the pre-modern period. Thank you for your attention. And here's my email address. I am very looking forward to our conversation after this. But if you have further questions that I didn't answer, please use this email. Thank you.
Please, thank you, Dr. Sujung Kim, with a loud applause. Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. This was amazing.
Thank you. So any questions, I'd be very happy to answer.
Yeah, so we will have about 30 minutes question and answer session. I know that audience are very excited to ask questions to Dr. Sujung Kim. And so I will collect questions from both chatting box and from the audience. So if you have questions, please raise your hands, like how Soyoung is now doing. So she'll be the first person to ask questions. Thanks so much. And I will organize all the questions in order and ask Dr. Kim to answer them accordingly. So if you also look into at the bottom of the Zoom screen, you'll see this chat bubble there. So you can use the chatting box to ask questions. If you want to send it to everyone, that's fine. If you want to keep it anonymous, I'll make sure to kind of make those questions anonymous and address directly to Dr. Sujung Kim. So let's first hear from Soyoung-sa. So please unmute yourself and thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sujung Kim, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I learned a lot from this rich presentation, and I'm really looking forward to reading more of your work. And as you mentioned that, nothing that much done about pre-modern, medical history and the talisman, even though its importance in everyday life wasn't that much, focused or just received attention from many people. So I couldn't agree more with all the points that you made today. So I'd like to ask simply two questions. One is, whether you can elaborate more on the social aspect of creating, maintaining, and circulating talisman. For instance, you did a really fascinating job in the kind of Korea period and early the Chosŏn, but later when it becomes more like a popular demand and popular kind of a circulation of those talismans, I mean, who actually draw and what kind of a material actually needed, any specific artistic technique was required, or whether it's sold in local temples. So I'd like to be thankful if you can elaborate more on that aspect. And the second one is, it's definitely Buddhist origins, but when you said that it was popular, hugely popular in late Chosŏn, whether it's really Buddhist elements that augmented that healing power of these talismans, because what you described reminds me of, you know, the healing attributes of donghak, even donghak. I mean, just the, you know, chanting and drinking water with all the ashes included. So from those women or other patients' point of view, it doesn't matter whether it's a Taoist or a Buddhist origins. I mean, they wanted to some spiritual or magical aspects of healing. So in that regard, what you define like a Buddhist healing elements, whether it's just coherently continued throughout Chosŏn period. So that's my second question. And I'm also curious, I mean, you well mentioned about the Monica Green and other, you know, magical medicine scholarship in China, but also have you checked it out, the Shadow Firth and Iri Wu? I remember that some of their chapters talking about this talisman practice in the birthing room. So that might be interesting to you as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor So. I admire your scholarship, and thanks for, first of all, coming here, and second, give me this wonderful comments. And I'm so good to also see you in face to face. So wonderful. These questions, excellent questions, and these are very important questions for my further research. But I can share what I know at this point, right? And because my project started about 2 years ago, I'm still feeling like I'm learning as I go. But the first point, yes, the social history is what I'm really interested in too, you know, and those details, the actors and how they connected and who sold and even what price and all these things, right? Those are still very hard to have one clear answer, but circumstantial answers I can give you. So I think there are sort of paintings, visual materials are often gives my you know, like a lot of evidence, because on Buddhist side, late Chosŏn Buddhists didn't really read left interesting records for me, so I rely on other disciplines evidence. And like Kim Hong-do's, a lot of Kim Hong-do's paintings depict everyday needs of the Chosŏn peoples, and in it there is I think two scenes. One is actually Buddhist monk-like, but also could be Taoist too. So it's, as you point out for the second point, by that point, right, or it's a scholarly bias or prejudice, right? People may have had very distinctive identities. Probably not. That is more modern projection. So in Kim Hong-do's paintings, we see that semi-Buddhists looking like two men are selling something very colorful, strips of papers on the market side. So that kind of gives me a clue that probably that is one common way to obtain Buddhist talismans, or I say Buddhist talisman because I'm primarily Buddhist scholar, but you can say Taoist talismans too. Probably doesn't matter. And actually the 24 talisman that I showed, right, it has 4 Taoist talismans too. And when I say Buddhist Taoist, it's for the sake of convenience, right? And Buddhism, Taoism, they always constantly borrowed each other. So when it comes to Taoist setting, Buddhism becomes Taoism. When it comes to Buddhism, it becomes Buddhism, right? Because they think that's ours. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention. And another thing that I often think about, also mentioned in my paper, is a Sujung Waterland Festival. That was one festival, even the Chosŏn royal families were okay with it throughout the Joseon period. So 수륙제, mostly, so basically saving the, wandering souls. So this idea hunting ghosts was always daunting for people, right? So this 수륙제 was one major sort of venue where Buddhists were actually could gather. As you know, in Joseon Shillok tells you, right, Buddhism was, it's kind of common narrative, was severely suppressed. One reason we can know that is basically if Joseon women goes to the temple, they get flogging, 100 floggings. So basically, legally, you cannot go to Buddhist temples. But that doesn't mean that they didn't go. They actually went a lot, because Shillok keeps saying that let's forbid people, let's prevent women from taking the tonsure and all this, and keep happening, right? So it is also possible that 수륙제 kind of thing, or like, as I said, like death, right? When it comes to death, either the monks come down. I said monks, but monastics. I like to use monastics rather than monks. I think that's important. So monastics come, or, somehow there are also like wandering monks or nuns too. At that time, they perform some acupuncture. And so there are these different social actors that has been really captured in the main, historical narratives, were very busy with healing, so that's kind of another thing that I think my further studies on talisman can a little more about it. For the second question, so I said hugely popular. One thing that I want to also clarify that is, there are bibliographical studies on these different Buddhist texts. And by fact, we know that Dharani texts were by far the most widely produced at temples. So we know that those, we can even draw very clear networks of these temples, which temple were very active in producing those things. But also the counting how many numbers of those texts are left. So the Crown Dharani is one of the highest if you make the graphs, right? And but what is interesting about it is new religions like Donghak or other religions, when the Chejeo and all these people, when the new religions leader in the late Joseon period, when they start new religions, they always use talismans. And they emphasize their healing powers too. So that's kind of interesting aspects of constant borrowing, and shamanism too, Buddhism, Taoism. They're basically, as you know, right, Orthodoxy is Neo-Confucianism, and the rest is kind of lumped into the same group. So I think that really actually help them to communicate more, I think. So that's kind of my hypothesis. I hope that I answered some of your questions. I actually like to get the reference of those two scholars later. So I will I will contact you later. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for that, detailed answer. I have another question from Rose B. If you don't mind, I can read out loud your question to Dr. Kim. So can you speak to the criticism around shamanic use of talisman?
Yeah, that's also a great question. Criticism around shamanic use of talismans. I wish I can get some more context where this question comes from. But and at the moment, I'm lacking the use of talismans in shamanic circle. But actually, I wrote one article couple of years ago on skanda. Skanda is in Korean Witechan or Weituo in Chinese, or idaten in Japanese. So these are sort of example of what I just mentioned, right? It's start with Vedic, right? Indian Vedic thought, and then it becomes Buddhist deity who protects Buddhist relics. But then at the end, we see that that deity is like venerated as Dongjin Bosal in shamanic pantheon. So I think that question can be also maybe makes me think, these rigid characters of shamans and Buddhists and Taoism can be also more in a maybe questions in a different way so that we can actually have more holistic understanding rather than how this was perceived in particular circle here. So maybe I will think about this question, Rose B. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next questions come from Maya Stiller, and she also mentioned in another chat that her answer was quite answered when Dr. Kim was giving answer to Soyoung-seo about the, I think it was about the religious syncretism that Buddhist talisman share a lot of kind of components from also Taoist traditions as well, in that way that how things are seemingly very different from kind of modern definition of religion that seems more kind of exclusive with lesser interactions. But I think maybe it's useful just to read out loud Maya Steeler's question to give a context to other audience. So let me read this. So wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Sujung. I learned a lot. Could you say a bit more about ascribing a talisman to a particular religious tradition? If the same talisman is used in the Buddhist, Confucian, and popular context, what does that tell us about the Chosŏn religious landscape? And the reason why I also read that is because it is also connected to the following question given by Janet Lee. Janet Lee, I wonder if it's okay for me to read out loud your question, or do you want to have this chance to also introduce yourself and to read your question? Sorry for giving you pressure. Okay, yeah, will do. I'll read it out loud. So thank you so much for your inspiring talk. I'm also intrigued by the categories of the talismans that you mentioned, one of the Buddhist circle or text, and the other from a non-Buddhist group. As Maya already asked, I wonder what other sources, tradition, especially in the non-Buddhist circle, might have shaped the talisman culture. Maybe Taoist influence? So yeah, thank you. That's the question.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Janet, and Maya. Thank you so much for coming. And I just read your article last night on Taoism. That was wonderful. And thank you for the question. And Janet Lee, thank you for your also awesome question. So I wonder what sources, traditions, but non-Buddhist circle might have shaped the talisman culture. Yes. So you're onto something, Janet, because I am also interested in more broader sort of influences as well. And what is really crazy as my study goes that I found is that Islamic talisman culture is so similar to what's happening in Joseon. Of course, I'm not making direct, connection between Islamic tradition or even Jewish. And if you, after this talk, if you're interested in incantation bowls, just Google it and find it. It's so interesting, how Dharani kind of things in circular shapes are written to sort of capture demons and used for healings. So actually this idea of making particular sound and, write it down the sound or particular shape of certain characters has, if you do it correctly, and it can summon some divinities to combat, to fight against demons, often kind of seen as the cause of illness, right? So I don't want to say there is one model, but there are different models to explain this very similarly happening cross-cultural, culturally visible sort of patterns. And what I like to say here is that maybe more studies on cross-cultural studies maybe help me to answer your question better. For Korean side, of course, probably that constant influx of Taoist texts like the Jade Pivot, that Okchugyong in Korean was one of the famous Taoist texts that kept, it was actually part of the civil examination systems until at one point, it was Yeon Sang-gung or somebody, I think, This is something with the text. It was excluded in the later the 과거 시험 subjects. But 옥주경 was very important. All the Joseon intellectuals were interested in reading that text, and it has several talismans that seems to be also kept going on throughout the Joseon period. So that's kind of one obvious Taoist talismans. And also I can tell you that another so in this talk I showed this safe childbirth talisman from the Buddhist text, but also 최생부, right, from directly coming from the Chinese medical tradition. But there is also actually safe childbirth talisman, different safe childbirth talismans used by different groups too, differentiate, totally different. So you can say that maybe that is maybe another, the third, right, the Taoist group. So that's kind of where I can finish, I think, my thinking here, but I will think more about these non-Buddhist circles in sort of influence or interactions with these Buddhist talismans too.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left for the Q&A session, and I think we will have chance to take one or two more questions. So I will read out loud the other questions. So another one comes from Seung-Hae Lee. So let me read this out loud. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I learned a lot. I was wondering how stable the iconography of safe childbirth talisman was. Did it ever change? So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Seung-Hae, for coming. And she's one of my close colleagues here from logged in from Korea. So yes, as I said, it starts with 3 different characters. It seems as you saw in the Fangshan stone Tripitaka, and at some point it kind of stacks all closely together, right? For I don't know, practical reason or for some religious reason, I do not know. And as I said, it kind of coexist. We see both editions keep alive in the Joseon period. But if you look at each edition carefully, all are slightly different, unless it's just the recarving of the same wood blocks. It's what is really fascinating about the study of talisman is they were very highly tolerant about the variations of iconographic variations. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but if it's more or less, the structure is more or less same, close enough, and it appears in the same context, which in this case, the Great Dharani Sutra, that is, recognizable. So I think that's my answer to your question.
Thank you for that. And Maya Stiller also kind of comment on the Taoist talisman and mentioning about her recent published article discuss about the 옥주 복용,
Yes.
which also Dr. Kim also referenced in her answer, the previous answer. So yeah, I see there is lots of kind of interconnections between those different religious traditions, intercrossing on this ritual and object.
Sorry. Yes.
Okay, so another question that I have is from Cesar Pucho. I'm sorry if I'm reading your name correctly. So here's a question from Cesar Pucho. So Shinto talisman from Japan are also similar to Taoist Korean shamanist talisman. I think everything is interconnected. Yes, so yeah, that's the kind of comment. So yeah, Dr. Kim, would you like to kind of elaborate on that point further?
Yes, well, I also wrote something on Japanese talisman, and yeah, I can agree you more. Shinto talisman. Shinto also was another sort of religious player in Japan, along with Onmyodo, right? Were very interested in using talismans for various ritual purpose, and yes, everything interconnected. I can agree. Yes. I think I can leave you there.
Yeah, as as a moderator, maybe I can also kind of, not a kind of question, but just to congratulate on this really wonderful work, because I learned a great deal, like everyone else did, because yeah, my basic understanding of Buddhism is just about these three jewels of Buddha, like the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, which has been kind of the kind of conventional way of studying about Buddhism as a whole. And that kind of really kind of connected with the definition of religion that modern scholars have mostly kind of relied on, the kind of emphasis on the founder, the doctrine, and the church, which is kind of Western oriented, and which kind of comes up with this kind of problem of this invisible, very kind of strict division between secular kind of religion, secular realms, and the sacred realms. And I think the contributions that this work makes is kind of enormous in terms of kind of connecting it and also bringing kind of new aspects to other part of Korea's history. Kind of, for example, the story of Queen Insu is a kind of a wonderful contribution to the family history of the Yi royal family, and also the kind of the history of the Joseon monarchy, and also a different aspect of social history of Joseon Korea, history of medicine in Joseon Korea, which make us to kind of reconnect the religious aspect of life to kind of reconstruct the life of the people who lived in Joseon dynasty period. So this is a kind of wonderful work, and yeah, I'm really kind of looking forward to read the upcoming book. So thank you so much.
Would you buy the book? If
Absolutely. I need to buy this and yeah, use this for my teaching classes. Yeah, this is wonderful. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think
thank you
yeah,
so much.
That wraps up our Q&A session. So I'd like to thank Dr. Kim again for presenting this fascinating research. And I also like to thank every participant in today's Zoom meeting for making this event very live and integrating through active questions and participation. And before we end, I'd like to give the mic to Dr. Luis Botella Sanchez, who is also a leading member of our Joseon Society, to talk about everyone and about the welcome message. Okay, yeah, Luis.
Well, firstly, Professor Kim, thank you very much for your talk. I've learned a lot about talisman and the relevance to understand the Joseon society. And for the rest of attendance, thank you very much for attending to another event, this time hosted by Sean. I'm start programming the next Chosŏn History Society for 2023, and I would like to welcome any person who would be interested to participate with a session to just write me, and maybe we can figure out together a suitable date to schedule such presentation. I'm going to leave in the comment chat my email for convenience. If anybody is interested or thinking about the possibility of joining us with such an event as Professor Kim, please write me and we can figure out the details together and to make it suitable. If you also know about some other scholar who may be interested, let's encourage him or her to contact me again. Thank you, Sean, for hosting this event. It has been great. Thank you for joining us today.
So thank you very much. So yeah, we are hoping to set up the lineup for the next year's lecture series. So please let Luis know if you're interested in doing for the next one. So I will stop the recording now. So the formal program is over, and thank you so much everyone for participating in it. I hope you have a good night or a good morning or good afternoon for the rest of the day. Thank you very much.